Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. When those lights flicker that way, at my weight, you start to worry a little bit. So I'm glad that we're all okay here. Thank you very much for being here and participating in yet another of the many planning processes and community conversations that my staff and I have asked you all to participate in. This is a huge commitment of your time and energy, and I realize I'm asking over and over, but I want to thank you. Your participation is critical not only to this piece of business, but to all the other pieces of business that are at play. I want to especially thank City Council folks who are in committee meetings all day, and they're here again this evening to pay attention to what you all have to say and to participate themselves, and I appreciate their efforts as well. So this process is something that I talked about when I applied for this job. We have had considerable conversation, but mostly consternation over our zoning and subdivision regulations, and it was important to me, and I think clearly important to you, that we have a more meaningful conversation and work together to figure out ways to make planning work in the city of Missoula. And toward that end, I think we've been really fortunate to have a lot of help from our consulting group, Duncan Associates, and Kirk Bishop, who's here this evening, in effect to tell you what he's heard. And the beauty of our community and the beauty of serving this community is there's not a shrinking violet in the room. And there may be a few folks outside the room who still want to talk. So we've done our best to bring as many people to the table as possible so that this isn't my zoning and subdivision update or necessarily the city council's or the city of Missoula's, but yours. We all need to participate and own this and come to some agreement. And I, again, really appreciate you coming here this evening in that spirit. I think we're in a great position to actually make a difference in the way we do business. And again, that's all because of you. I have made it a practice to generally steer clear of these meetings so that you all can talk. And I'm going to be very interested in hearing what you all have to say this evening. There's a good chance that I'll mosey so that you can work on these issues, but I'll continue to pay careful attention to what you all are doing on behalf of your neighbors and fellow citizens. So again, I really thank you for being here, and there's more to come. So we've got your names, you're signed up, and we're not going to let you go for better or worse. So again, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce Kirk Bishop, who will deliver some news for you this evening and do some more listening. Kirk.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks to all of you. I want to add my thanks. I see a lot of familiar faces tonight, but some new ones as well, and I welcome your participation in this process. We have a fairly aggressive agenda this evening. The introductory remarks have largely been made. The meeting will begin with a presentation by me of an important kind of milestone document in this process to date. What we're calling the Concepts and Directions Report. This is a report that is really meant to reflect much of what we heard in the 40 to 50 odd small group listening sessions that we held over the last 6 months of 2007, in conversations with various interest groups, citizens at large, members of our mayoral and council appointed advisory group. But it also kind of reflects to some extent our experience in helping communities with these types of efforts in jurisdictions throughout the country, some of which share similar values and issues, some of which are quite different, but all of which have some experience to share. After I make what I hope is a fairly brief presentation of the report, I don't want to gloss over anything, but I want to remind you all that one of the things that I hope you were able to pick up on the way in is a sort of bullet summary of the major recommendations that are contained in the report. It's a front and back bullet point summary of the key conceptual recommendations in the report. You should have also received an agenda and a form that we're hopeful that you'll fill out as the mood strikes tonight, and we'll talk about that in a bit. After I make the presentation, in the interest of making sure that we can engage in a real conversation in a limited amount of time, we're going to do as we often do in these types of settings, and that is have kind of a small group discussion at the tables. We'll then report out. We'll ask for a designated spokesperson from the tables, kind of report out the salient discussion points from the tables, and as time allows, kind of get a general sense of the larger group about the priorities that seem to be percolating up from our conversation. We'll conclude by kind of talking about next steps. In terms of this project, as I say, most of the past few months have been spent by our consulting team working with staff from OPG, with our advisory group, and folks like yourselves who've given of their time to sort of listen and learn about the city of Missoula and its values. That effort is culminated in this report, this Concepts and Direction report that we're going to talk about tonight. After we conclude this stage of the process, and we are hopefully at about the conclusion of this Concepts and Direction stage, then we'll begin to deliver the new regulations, probably divvying them out in chunks of or modules of the new zoning and subdivision regulations over the coming months, and we'll have other opportunities to get together and gauge your reaction to more detailed recommendations. And again, at the conclusion of tonight, we'll talk about that. I thought I would clue you in, first of all, on the very scientific sort of diagnostic approach that we use to determining whether this kind of effort is useful at all. So we've devised for the city of Missoula a sort of 10-point test that tells us that it probably is about time to tackle this, what has been a very challenging effort. One of the first indications that it's time for zoning, and apologies to David Letterman and Jeff Foxworthy here, but we know it's time to update the zoning and subdivision regulations when both of the books are eligible for historic landmark status, which generally requires that they be 50 years or older. When the permits and project staff at OPG is eligible for hazardous duty pay because of the difficulty of administration and varying interpretations over time, another strong indication that it's time to tackle the zoning and subdivision regulations. When some, not all, zoning hearings are candidates for being shown on the Comedy Channel, that may be another indication that it's time for an update. When the book of regulations itself is classified by the librarians across the street in the foreign language section of the library, another good indication that maybe we ought to see if we can clean things up. As we look at the list of allowed uses in the zoning districts, when we see blacksmith shops, horseshoeing, and haberdasheries as the principal permitted uses, that's not true, by the way, in the commercial districts, it is another indication that it may be time for a modernization effort. When you go over to OPG office and say, I'd like to purchase a copy of the zoning ordinance, and it comes with a secret decoder ring, another strong indication. When the home-based business next door to us involves valet parking, I think our regulations are suspect and it may be time. So we were starting to get strong signals at about that point in the process. Whenever we go to a community and the local land use attorneys and development representatives tell us it's the best set of regulations they ever saw, it's the Full Employment Act for somebody who wants to get a project approved, another strong indication that it's time to tackle this effort. When Missoula starts, when the Missoula staff planners start calling their colleagues over in Ravalli County to see how they do things over there, we know it's time. And finally, and this is a peculiar Missoula one, when 9 out of 10 residents polled can cite to me exactly what the state statutes say about the rights of neighbors to protest various forms of applications, another strong indication that maybe we ought to look at our regulations and see if we can make things a little easier in terms of accommodating modern development practices. In all seriousness, the findings in this report and our major recommendations come about based on a pretty straightforward process. Review of the existing regulations, review of the planning documents that supposedly provide a sense of the vision of Missoulians for the place in which they live, driving and walking tours of the city and its various neighborhoods help us form some impressions about development issues that ought to be addressed. And of course, again, playing off of that very important public input from the listening session stage of the process was critical in helping us formulate our preliminary recommendations for the types of issues we ought to tackle. As we talk tonight, I want you to kind of key in on several points, or just actually 2 or 3 basic points to be thinking about. Do we seem to be heading in the right direction? We're going to be talking in fairly general terms. So, devil's in the details with this. You're free to, at later stages in the process, say, I didn't think that you were talking about that, and I don't like that. But from a conceptual standpoint, do we seem to be heading in the right directions? Also, are there issues that we've just plain missed that you were telling us about and we didn't hear or understand you? Or are there approaches that we're recommending in conceptual terms that just don't seem to fit, that maybe we've tried before and it just hasn't worked out? Tell us about that tonight, if you would. And also be thinking about, reflecting back on earlier conversations that we have, what are your top priorities? Top 1, 2, or 3 priorities for the update effort? And those are the questions that we're going to ask you to focus on in your small group discussions and you report out. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a little far away from the microphone. Just raise your hand if I do that. I'm likely to do that again. The listening sessions, themes percolating up, fairly common themes from many of those listening sessions. We heard, obviously, a diversity of viewpoints, but there were several themes that seemed to sort of play out through at least the majority of the listening session. Again, something we heard when we got together in June in our initial public meeting, the need for regulations that are clear and consistent, that are transparent, that are predictable, that Missoulians, not surprisingly, care about their neighborhoods and cherish the characteristics that they think are truly unique to their neighborhood, so neighborhood preservation. Infill development, you might not be surprised to learn that we heard a fair amount about past efforts to encourage or accommodate infill, some successful, some not. Housing issues, housing affordability has become a very important issue in Missoula. Housing options for older people, people of various income, age groups, and ability levels. Not surprisingly, a theme that has played out in Missoula and the region for quite some time is the importance of natural resource preservation, preserving options for transportation, and the role of various boards and commissions, and the importance of public involvement opportunities, both in this process and throughout the development, review, and approval process. One of the first chapters in the report is kind of a softball chapter, and it's one that I think we can universally embrace, and it talks about regulations that are easier to use, understand. The existing ordinance suffers from organizational deficiencies. The way information is presented is confusing, sometimes internally conflicting. There are countless zoning districts, and yet while there may be 40-some base zoning districts, and God, how many special planned unit development or special size zoning districts, it seems like we still haven't nailed it in terms of having the right districts to accommodate the type of development that we really want to encourage. The use regulation system, playing off of the blacksmith shop theme, is a bit outdated, kind of unwieldy, forces us into a situation where we need to interpret our way to accommodate sort of modern commerce and business and housing types within the community. Suffice it to say, frustrations abound for everyone with the existing system. In terms of the complexity of the ordinance, it wasn't always so. This is the zoning map that was originally in place in 1932 when the city first adopted zoning with 4 zoning classifications. Interestingly, Missoula is one of the few places I've worked in the last 20 years where all 4 of those still exists. Oftentimes there are amendments that sort of transition your way into a more modern system. It's not to say that there aren't some good features of the existing A, B, C, and D classifications, but it is a marked contrast if we look at today's ordinance and today's zoning map against that original zoning map. I'm sure all of you can agree it's a very different situation today. Sometimes for good reason, the addition of new districts and complexity, sometimes for no apparent reason at all. So our recommendations are, first of all, I think from our perspective at least, it makes sense for the city to continue to use a zoning ordinance and a separate set of subdivision regulations as the way to do things, as opposed to trying to meld them together into a unified development code framework. That's not to say that the regulation shouldn't be unified and consistent in their approach, and that definitions and procedures shouldn't be sort of the same throughout the documents. But for technical, legal, and other reasons, we're recommending that the standalone subdivision and zoning regulation approach continue into the future. We're going to be looking for opportunities as we move forward to consolidate existing zoning classifications where the similarities are so apparent that it makes, from the outside at least, imminent sense to see if we can consolidate them and simplify the structure. At the same time, we'll be looking at needs and opportunities to create new zoning districts that accommodate modern development trends. We'll be looking at ways to modernize the use classification system, and it's to standardize things that have been added to the ordinances as opinions or interpretations that, we either need to rethink those interpretations or opinions or put them down as part of the ordinance. And of course, adding ease of use features like more graphics and illustrations and tables and charts as a way to convey information makes sense to us. Using plain English wherever possible to convey the regulatory intent. We have a good index, table of contents, radical concepts, I know, but that can go a long way towards sort of resolving some of the frustrations that have come about to the existing ordinance. As we get into more of the substantive issues, we need to be looking, in our opinion, and in the opinion of many of those who've shared with us their thoughts to date, opportunities for greater variety and in terms of housing choices, housing options, and lifestyle choices. That many of our residential districts reflect the era in which they were created. It was only in the last 5 or so years that I think the city's zoning ordinance expressly addressed the modern concept of townhouse development. Now, when I say this, sometimes it may be, folks may think that I'm suggesting that new housing types need to be added to each and every of the zoning districts. That's really not what the recommendation is about, but is making sure that we have zoning options for a variety of housing options and choices throughout the community. The recommendations are, our recommendations are to tailor those residential zoning classifications and mixed-use zoning classifications so that they do accommodate and encourage a very wide range of housing options and choice for people, again, of all income, age, and ability levels, and that those regulations reflect the physical characteristics of our neighborhoods. That we have an opportunity to implement more flexibility in some of our residential classifications to encourage greater preservation of open space, particularly within the lower density classifications. And that leads me to one of the sort of big ideas in the report, and that is that from our perspective, the city's attempt at cluster development, both in terms of low-density suburban areas and in terms of more urban neighborhood cluster, hasn't worked all that well. And that we probably need to scrap that approach and start over. And I think throughout this process, it makes sense for us to be looking at opportunities to encourage the production of affordable or workforce housing wherever possible. Sometimes people's expectations for what zoning can accomplish with regard to housing affordability don't really square with reality, but one thing that zoning can do inadvertently, if unchecked, is present unnecessary obstacles to the production of affordable housing. And so we're going to be looking for opportunities to sort of build in incentives or remove at least unnecessary regulatory obstacles. We talk about tailoring standards. It's both in terms of different neighborhood types and in terms of the sort of range of place types that we find in Missoula, ranging from almost semi-rural, low-density suburban, sort of tending down a spectrum to places that are, all the way through more urban neighborhoods, even into the downtown. And that the regulations really need to reflect those different place types and neighborhood types. And that's something we'll be looking to do. As we look at expanding the range of housing options, again, we need to make sure that there are places for townhouse development, that there are places to do vertical mixed-use development where housing units exist above shops. And wherever possible, we need to make sure that, that the regulations encourage people to provide those options in the right places. Looking at zero lot line and other sort of modern housing types and housing arrangements that can be successfully integrated into the city's overall framework for neighborhood development. Okay. So we talk about scrapping and starting over with regard to cluster development. One form of cluster development, something that I like to rather refer to as conservation development or open space style development, wherein instead of regulating solely on the basis of minimum lot size, what we say with a given parcel of land, more in like a greenfield type setting, is we don't care so much about the minimum lot size. This isn't, again, this isn't in existing neighborhoods, but in a new subdivision setting. Can't we provide opportunities for people to preserve significant portions of the tract as open space because of the presence of natural resources, or because we simply want to provide passive or active open space opportunities for residents of that subdivision? Can't we find a way to better encourage that sort of development? Our cluster regulations as they exist today don't probably go far enough in encouraging that type of housing. And again, with regard to the neighborhood cluster concept, again, the idea is let's throw out what we've tried and start over, trying to address more methodically some of the issues that have arisen with those types of developments. The theme for commercial and mixed-use zoning classifications, we have a chapter entitled Expanding Places to Work, Shop, Play, and increasingly, we hope, places where people can live. The commercial districts don't cut it with regard to achieving those simple objectives today. They are mostly differentiated on the basis of whether or not you can do one form of commercial development or another in a commercial classification. Very little emphasis in those districts on what the development actually looks like, how it's oriented towards the street and sidewalk, how buildings are positioned on the lot. We can do a lot more in terms of addressing physical character, and that should become more and more the defining distinction between our commercial and mixed-use districts, rather than sort of picayune distinctions based on one business type over the other. The commercial districts today permit residential uses, but they're not mixed-use districts per se. They are districts that can trend one way or another, without benefit of guidance from zoning. And that may be appropriate in some settings, but I think the city is deserving of true mixed-use classifications for at least some applications. And as we look at existing commercial corridors and the potential application of mixed-use zoning controls, we may find opportunities for housing and density along transit-served corridors that may be really lying fallow today, and that we can capitalize on, thereby, increase the amount of growth that can be accommodated within the existing urban area without directing it towards existing neighborhoods. Our recommendations, again, are looking for opportunities to reorganize and consolidate the district regulations, do more to address physical character, what that district looks like, what kind of place do the district regulations create. Is it pedestrian oriented? Is it geared more towards the automobile, and the emphasis is on taming the effects that auto-oriented commercial places can have? Promoting mixed-use development. Looking for opportunities to do a better job of accommodating commercial serving land uses in or near residential neighborhoods. I know that there have been in the past some individual sort of site-specific controversies that have arisen with proposals to put a neighborhood-serving land use in a neighborhood, and by and large those have been sort of successfully resolved through a kind of a long, laborious public process. What it indicates to us is that there are sort of unmet market and true neighborhood needs for this type of land use that you can walk to, that you can do some sort of neighborhood convenience shopping. And I think as part of this effort, we need to explore opportunities to create a tool, a neighborhood serving commercial tool that can be applied a bit more predictability, in a bit more predictable and consistent fashion. At least that's the hope. And of course, as the mayor alluded to early on, there's a lot of sort of ongoing planning efforts, not least of which is the downtown master plan effort. And so far the excitement level for that has been high, and deservedly so. I think we need to look at this project as an opportunity to implement some exciting ideas that'll be emerging in the coming weeks and months out of that process, and need to ensure that what we're doing as part of zoning update and this project is consistent with and serves to implement that to the extent possible. When I talk about commercial and mixed-use districts that do a better job of addressing physical character or urban form, the types of things I'm talking about are building orientation, how connected those districts are with surrounding neighborhoods, and how connected the sites are along commercial and mixed-use corridors, how parking is handled on the site, landscaping, exterior lighting, things that create the sense of place that we get when we visit these areas. These determinants of character can be very important. Here are examples of the exact same use, but standards were in place to sort of dictate a different form. One very, very sort of conventional, auto-oriented urban form, and one that has a much more pedestrian urban feel. The right tool in the right place can make all the difference in the world, and we think the city is deserving of the right tool set for the right application in the right part of town. Reserving places for industry. Our analysis of the existing industrial districts is that they're fairly typical. Again, we need to look for opportunities to modernize the list of land uses allowed in those districts. But the thing that struck us most is, particularly with regard to the existing D district, is the extent to which residential use is allowed to sort of intermingle with light to moderate intensity industrial uses. You remember this D district was one of the original zoning classifications in existence today. And while there are some benefits to that sort of mixed use characteristic of the existing D district, it can present some challenges. By allowing industrial districts to be sort of no holds barred, all come kind of open-ended classifications. We can allow commercial uses to outbid industrial users for valuable industrial land that can be employment generating. We can inadvertently create land use conflicts as residential uses move into industrial zoned areas. So our initial recommendation was that the city may need to look at its industrial districts, particularly that D district, and sort of pull back on the extent to which residential uses are allowed there. That generated a fair amount of discussion at the advisory group level and at the staff level. So we still believe that industrial districts, by and large in the new ordinance, need to be reserved for industry, because industry still has a role in Missoula's economy, in a broad definition of industry. But in doing so, I'm convinced now that we need to be careful that we don't reduce the already short supply of land that's available for higher density forms of housing. So that D district is providing an important function in the community. And some of the neighborhoods that have it in place have benefited from the relative ease to which it's possible to do different forms of housing at different density levels. So we're going to need to explore that a bit further to see how we can address the potential for land use conflict that can come about when residential and industrial are allowed sort of cheek and jowl in the same zoning classification, but without unwittingly furthering the loss of land that's available for different types of housing. There's a chapter in the report called Focusing on Design. Our assessment of the regulations, what we heard in discussions to date, is that attempts in the past to regulate design have been hit or miss. Depending on who you talk to, maybe more misses than hits. So we look at the multifamily guidelines, the multifamily regulations, the townhouse regulations, hillside, no matter what you sort of classify in there. Examples of good and bad, successful and not so occasionally. The general lack of standards has really enabled sort of auto-dependent, unsustainable development patterns to emerge in areas where we maybe should have been more mindful of physical design. Many folks with whom we talked said we need better tools to preserve unique neighborhoods, whether they are qualify for historic status or whether they simply have unique characteristics in terms of architecture, building forms, platting patterns, or what, that can preserve truly unique places. And many of you thought that the sign ordinance could definitely be improved, and it's not the first time I've heard that in a community. Our sense, again, and I've said it in the commercial districts discussion, is there is a place in the ordinance for some basic urban design, clear, predictable standards that address physical form or urban form in the ordinance. Regulations that in some places need to ensure that our best pedestrian and transit-oriented areas remain viable and even more so successful. That might be time to roll out some tools that would allow for truly unique neighborhoods to have their own kind of neighborhood conservation zoning in place. There are situations invariably where no single set of comprehensive zoning ordinance can address all neighborhoods in the way that they need to be addressed. And so it's important to have a tool in place that, again, reserved for truly special circumstances, based on a neighborhood plan where we can put zoning regulations in place that help to implement that plan. I know that for some, it's been a frustration in the past. A lot of effort's gone into some neighborhood planning efforts, and yet there were no teeth to ensure eventual implementation. The danger with throwing out the idea of a neighborhood conservation zoning is that it sort of seized upon by all neighborhoods who think that they're deserving of their own special zoning ordinance. And that's a more sort of unworkable sort of situations, as every neighborhood has its own separate zoning ordinance, and the administrative complexities of something like that are probably untenable. But there are situations where we do need to preserve or provide a tool in the ordinance to capture truly unique situations. The role of the Design Review Board was a sort of constant question that emerged in several of our sessions. And so the general theme here is that we need to clarify the role of the Design Review Board, as well as all actors within the development review process. Whose role and responsibility and duty is it to do various things within the review process? Is that we look at design standards, we take into account street type that we're talking about, whether it's a pedestrian-oriented area, an auto-oriented area at the other end, or some kind of hybrid between the two. And then there are opportunities to clean up the sign regulations. I hesitate to hold out expectations for a sort of comprehensive overhaul of the sign regulations as a part of this effort, because that can be a project unto itself, and with the possibility to kind of distract us from the broader mission. But there are some things we can do to make those existing regulations easier to use and understand. I got some examples here of how sometimes basic sorts of controls applied to the same land uses can produce distinctly different characteristics. Here's a drugstore application, and you can see that the application of basic urban design controls regarding the location and orientation of buildings, how parking is handled, building setbacks and the like can produce very different results, ranging from very suburban to more urban-centered and even downtown applications. And left to its own devices, the market can sometimes do this fine, but sometimes we leave vulnerable our best, particularly when it comes to pedestrian-oriented areas like downtown and some of the surrounding neighborhoods. Without some basic controls in place, we are vulnerable to development that is at odds with the intended character of those areas. The emphasis on design is not meant to say that use issues won't be important in the new zoning ordinance. We'll continue to have a list of allowed land uses, but we hope that the list will be shorter, more modern, and more broadly group functionally similar land uses together, and say very clearly in which zoning classifications they are allowed. Preservation of the environment, sustainability, green, very strong themes that emerged in our discussions. I think we all agree that we can do more to support broadly held objectives for sustainable development in a variety of areas in the ordinance. We just kind of need to just put that out there as one of the primary priorities and objectives of this project, and just kind of use that as a touchstone as we move forward into the drafting. Are we doing all that we can to balance resource conservation with development interests? Are we directing development away from critical resource areas? Are we providing the incentives and flexibility to ensure that we can preserve areas and yet allow development to occur within the community? By and large, we find in efforts like this that there are unintended regulatory obstacles to doing the right thing when it comes to the environment, when it comes to wind energy and solar and water conservation. Sometimes there are regulatory obstacles that sort of hide out in the zoning regulations and the subdivision regulations that work against those objectives. And I think we can make great inroads by removing those obstacles without imposing a bunch of heavy-handed controls to address greening and sustainability objectives. Oops. Transportation is hiding out under the chapter called Connecting People and Places. Again, we can do better in terms of regulations that support walkable, transit-supportive development, transit-friendly environments within the community. The density restrictions in the ordinance today, the lack of land zoned for higher density development and mixed-use development is working at odds with your objectives to support transit and walkability. Parking regulations seem to be not as bad as we see in some places, but I think we can do more to provide flexibility to accommodate access to sites that maybe don't always involve reserving vast portions of the site for private automobiles. So we're kind of providing a menu of options for how accessibility and transportation can be supported by zoning ordinance. So we talk about connecting people and places. It has a lot of meanings and a lot of benefits. One of the sort of one of the benefits that people don't think about a lot is the public health benefits that can come with continuing to do more. Missoula does a lot in terms of providing alternative transportation options for folks, but we can do more. And we can do more in terms of making sure that places are as connected as possible, and there are options for people to get from here to there, how they can access open space and public lands, as well as shopping, convenience, and entertainment opportunities near their home without necessarily relying on the single occupant vehicles to do it. So we need to provide, in our opinion, and in the opinion of many that we've talked to, at least options in the ordinance for residential densities that will be more supportive of transit. That we continue to sort of push the idea of a connected network of trails and streets and sidewalks and bicycle routes throughout the community. That we plan for and encourage transit-oriented development. And that we look for opportunities in revising the parking regulations to remove any unnecessary regulatory obstacles to doing that. And again, looking at opportunities to have a more flexible approach. You know, many people, when we start talking about bicycles and walking, they say, well, gosh, that's something you read in the book. The importance of this is that we're all pedestrians at some point in the journey. We all get out of our car once we arrive at the place, and we still, and it's even at that level that we need to be more concerned about providing safe, attractive options for people to get about the community in something other than a vehicle. That kind of plays into one of the final chapters in the book. It talks about rehabilitation, reuse, and reinvestment. Again, the emphasis is we need to do more. The greenest form of development is reusing what we have, rehabilitating what we have. Sometimes, particularly if we let the regulations get pretty far out of date, they can work against our objectives to reuse, rehabilitate, and revitalize areas that already exist. Types of things that we encounter are, parking regulations, unintended consequences of setback and other regulations that they have on older buildings. So as with sustainability and many of the other things, looking for opportunities to remove those regulatory obstacles, maybe an opportunity to not treat all non-conforming situations the same. Sometimes non-conforming situations have a very negative connotation when it comes to zoning, sometimes deservedly so, but sometimes things that are cherished and important parts of our neighborhood and community structure are caught up in that sort of negative prejudice that comes against things that were legally established and no longer meet the regulations today. And to the extent that we can, we'd like to be able to draw distinctions between the types of non-conforming situations that can be character-giving and can create quality places, and that we need to lighten up a little bit on, and those that we really need to hammer in terms of getting them to go away. And we're looking through case files of the Board of Adjustment and discussions with staff to identify things that have been a sort of constant source of requests for relief and variances as an indication of maybe a standard that ought to be adjusted, maybe not, but at least looking to that as a pool of potential candidates. And again, the types of things that we'll need to be looking at when it comes to rehabilitation, reuse, parking, nonconformities, maybe greater use of standards that are based on the context, the surrounding context, what's happening on the block, as opposed to what's written in the book. There may be a way to say that in some situations, if the surrounding character is X, then what you need to do is meet that surrounding character as opposed to a rigid standard in an ordinance. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how that plays out. Finally, a chapter on reducing reliance on special zoning districts. I asked for an inventory as we began this process of how much land was zoned in the various zoning classifications, expecting to get back a spreadsheet with 41 zoning districts and the amount of land area classified in each one of those districts. What I got was a list of about 100, maybe 120 classifications that had the 41 that are written in the book, and then the 60-odd that have been created because there wasn't a good way to accommodate some special development proposal that the city actually liked. That was really, they were trying to do the right thing. A traditional neighborhood development in the right place requires a special district. We don't have a tool. We got to go through a planned unit development process. Got to go through a lot of brain damage sometimes to achieve what we say we want in the community. So again, another indication to us that we need to be looking at, are there opportunities in the ordinance to add standardized tools that will accommodate these types of development without over-reliance on planned unit developments in special districts. Again, as I talked about that early in the process, there were some who were fearful that I meant, and understandably so, that I meant that planned unit developments can just go away. We'll just remove the ability to do special types of site-specific development approvals. That's really not what I'd intended. I think that there is a reason to have a sort of site-specific, a way to do a site-specific development application that's sort of write your own ticket, but only when you've proved up that there's really no way to accommodate it. Sometimes we latch onto the special zoning district too quickly, and it's creating a fairly unwieldy system that even minor modifications later on, we need to go back through a kind of rezoning process to do what could be a very easy thing to do. There are some appendices in the report, a summary of what we heard in the various listening sessions, a more sort of in-depth, technical-oriented summary of some of what we heard, particularly at the OPG staff level, but are based on our own independent analysis of shortcomings within the existing ordinance, a summary table of allowed uses. At this point, we're going to do it as I said, and we're going to break into small groups. Again, I'm going to ask each of the groups to kind of hone in on those basic core questions that I posed at the outset. Am I at least talking a good game at this point? Does it sound like if we're able to pull some of this off that we'll be on track? If there are things we missed, I want you to talk about that at the table. And there's scratch pads, recycled paper at your table. I'd ask that maybe there be a designated note taker and table reporter. We're going to give you at least a half an hour to go through it, kind of come up with your table's kind of informed consent, and then we'll ask for a report out, and so we'll flick the lights when you have about 5 or 10 minutes left, and we'll make the rounds to see how you're doing. In the reporting out, if we could get our table spokespeople geared up. I think we're going to try and walk a microphone around to the various tables. Yes. All right, okay. Jen, are you going to walk the microphone around? Are you going to walk it around? Denise, why don't you get us started there in the back? I don't know what table number that is, but again, the plan is we're going to ask the group to report out answer three basic questions from the group's perspective. And I realize this is a challenge. There's a noisy room, several discussions going on. But to the extent possible, if you can answer 3 basic questions from us. As a group, what tended to sort of emerge from your discussion? a sense that we were going in the right direction or in the wrong direction. So yes or no, are we headed in the right direction? And then things we missed, try and keep it to one or two. We'll take into account your individual responses to dig deeper, but as a table, one or two things. Were there one or two things that seemed everybody said, I can't believe they didn't address that? And one or two things, and I'm hoping we don't get many in these columns, but I'm prepared for the worst. And things we just got wrong, one or two things. So Denise, get us started back there. Thank you.
Okay, number one, yes. Things that were missed, we didn't see much about minimizing cost to future generations, like natural resources or money, minimizing the costs our children will have to pay in the future. Another thing that might have been missed or was missed was some mention of green building, where the siting or the materials used or the building costs, or there were at least, or no, I think there might have been something about building codes or at least incentives, and maybe a list of minimum and optimum standards so that a person might want to buy a house that had optimum standards in terms of green buildings. And then two things that people said were missing were, make sure that the neighborhood character you're trying to preserve is one that you would value in the future. And another is, in the pursuit of affordability, don't destroy something where the housing costs will still go up and you'll find that the neighborhood character was lost. And finally, there was a question, where was the workforce housing?
Okay. I will add that workforce housing was added as a specific element of this report in response to the initial advisory group draft. So if you'll look in that, as you get an opportunity to look at the report again, look in that housing variety and choice chapter, and you'll see a concluding section that tackles head-on the issue of affordable workforce housing as an issue that we need to confront as part of this. Hopefully getting policy guidance from the effort that's been spearheaded by the mayor's office in beginning a conversation about sort of policy guidance on that front. But go ahead. Next.
Okay. At our table, we had a long, wide-ranging discussions, not a lot of conclusions, a lot of wide-ranging discussions. Once we got down to the generally agree, we came up with an S, with a yes as far as the answers. Do we think you generally agree with what the direction you're going here? A lot of specifics that they were concerned about, a lot of which can't necessarily be addressed with zoning. One of the biggest problems identified is in the process of planning, to be planning the transportation at the same time that you're planning the development. So if you're going to densify areas, then the planning for the transportation that's going to create would have to come along with that. And of course, it isn't part of the zoning rewrite, but it's something that the city has to be looking at if they're going to be changing the zoning. And the other thing that we thought should be identified more clearly is that as we look at all of these things, we should be looking very carefully at each and every change made as to whether it makes housing more expensive or less expensive, more affordable or less affordable, because that is one of our largest problems in the city and shows every sign of getting worse before it gets better. And top priorities, I would say that the 6 people here, there were 8 or 10 different top priorities. Transportation being one, sidewalks being another, affordability being another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we did not end up with 1 or 2 top priorities we all agreed on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Again, yes, no, things we missed, things we got wrong.
Thanks. Can we own this? Can we so I can see this thing? Okay.
We're going to take into account the sort of priority thing. I know that was a question on the list. It's just that we expected that was going to be not possible to distill that to 1 or 2 responses. So we'll take those from your individual written responses and encourage you to turn those in on the way out. Thanks a lot. Andrea.
Hi, Kirk. Thanks. Our group also had, varied and fruitful conversation. And in general, yes, we think that we're headed in the right direction. We didn't come up with something specific in terms of an issue or a problem that hasn't been adequately addressed, but the general consensus of the table was that there's a lack of details in the list, and the list was more or less left open for interpretation. And I take that to mean possibly that you may have I think the group of people in this room are very well educated and are actually quite up to speed on the subject that we're talking about, but we have a whole community out there that's maybe not. And in terms of being clear with what we're up to with the subdivision rewrite, that this comment from this table might be indicative of the community at large, maybe missing some details in terms of this list. And then our top priorities for the update effort are streamlined regulations and predictability/consistency. Thank you.
So reporting for table 12 here. Yes, you're on the right path. What was missed? We had a lot of discussion here about true green design, site design kinds of questions that we in Missoula aren't very good at. And so even more of that, we believe, would be worthy and should be, and I know zoning has its limits, but it can influence that outcome, notwithstanding the IRC. Some of the key topics was, I hope I'm getting this right, gang, so you can help me out on that. We had a wide-ranging discussion like everybody does, but one of them is that the city of Missoula is not all urban. The city of Missoula could be everything from high density to ag land and open space. And our zoning code doesn't really accommodate that very well on either end. The other is transition between uses, how to do it. Don't have a suggestion, but whether it's buffers or just the other side of the street, or an intensity measurement of similar intensities but different uses are compatible and okay. And finally, the note I have about more examples from other places. Folks here want to see what other people in other jurisdictions, for you to put some of those online about here's a good example on this and here's a good example on that. And I don't know if we had a top priority. I think what I read were all top priorities.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave.
Table 6 here. On the question of right or wrong direction, we had a plurality in favor of right direction. It was 3 in favor, 2 sort of wrong direction, and then 2 neutral or give me more information. Some of the things that we were looking for to be fleshed out or changed around are the questions of, one, when there are incentives for some particular kind of development to happen, that there be accountability for the actual outcome. So affordable housing came to mind, cluster development, mixed use. When we say that we want these things and we give them an express track, we should be assured that we're going to get the outcome that we want. And then another thing is addressing the transition question. This came up specifically in the context of if you're changing a zoning regulation on something that's zoned a certain way, how is that not a rezoning, was basically the question that came out of the group. And then I guess in sort of a top priority for the effort, if I could summarize, we didn't address this specifically, but we like that there's a diversity of options in this thing. And we think that's really important. There's, I think, a level of mistrust at our table that was coming out, and so there's some feeling that we don't want to sacrifice the good things that we have in order to get the diversity that is promised from the zoning ordinance. So does that capture it?
Great, thank you, Tracy. I think.
So reporting for table 2, it's interesting that we had a unanimous yes on the right direction.
Wow.
Okay, we had a unanimous yes on going in the right direction. After a lot of discussion, we couldn't really think of anything we didn't really agree with in terms of the general direction. The thing that we would add is that you mentioned the coordination with the downtown master planning process, but we wondered about the West Broadway plan, other comprehensive plans for the north side and west side plan, the Y Mullen Road, if all of those comprehensive plans are going to be taken into consideration in terms of looking at this effort. And then related to that is communications between the consultants and all these different plans so that they're not like ships in the night. And, okay, then in terms of things that were missed, there was concern about the river corridor being addressed, particularly between the river and Broadway, between Russell and Orange, the riparian areas, and where commercial might be appropriate on the river, not too close to the river, but, you know, in the viewshed of the river. Viewsheds also came up, but later. And then we also were concerned about urban agriculture, thinking historically about victory gardens and then into the future, people wanting to be able to grow their own food, community gardens, easements, will that be addressed? So those were
Okay.
the things we thought were not in.
Thank you. That's good.
All right. Right direction, yes. We think we're going the right direction. I don't think anything was missed, but maybe some focus on a couple of things. One, more focus on design and get away from zoning by traditional mapping. Instead, insist on quality of design, which allows some flexibility. And then more attention to the link between land use and transportation, in that the community's decisions about where to invest transit monies should be tied to good land use policies and zoning. The top priorities would be to continue this inclusive process and to get to adoption sooner than later.
Table 7 was 5 in favor. The things we feel that were missed, we didn't see anything about agriculture in the city, and obviously that's important. The other thing we didn't see was any enforcement. Once this comes in to play and it's all changed, is there going to be any change, any multi-regulatory backbone applied so that there is actual enforcement of the zoning? That's one of the issues that exists now. It didn't appear to be addressed. And the third one was not just zoning of industrial space, but actual preservation for the future of industrial space, for future opportunity to draw jobs to the area. Our top priorities for the update effort was a schedule, perhaps, for the phased implementation of the new zoning. There's some discussion if this was all adopted at one time, we would leave basically put a big blip in the process of everybody having to learn everything all at once, as well as the Office of OPG, as well as all of the engineers and other land developers that are trying to present something. Perhaps some kind of phased implementation where there could be some flow. And the second issue is actually two, is more emphasis on the maintenance rather than growth. One, more emphasis on maintenance within the zoning regulations of how to, we're seeing a lot of growth issues, but how do we deal with what we actually have and maintain that quality? And the second is how do we maintain and grow these zoning regulations once we adopt them. In the 1930s, what we have probably looked very black and white and was very clear and has since evolved into various shades of gray. Is there some kind of vehicle within here to continue to update this in a reasonable manner?
We drew straws to see who would speak. Table 3, I don't know if we were as organized as everybody else. We were kind of all over the boards in our discussions, but we had a clear yes in the right direction with a respectful maybe. And we have things that were missed, maybe references to neighborhood plans in zoning code, regulations, trying to make that more of a structured relationship and make sure that there was clear notification of all property owners in that process. Maybe some more emphasis on transit-oriented development. There was some discussion, but just to focus on that kind of led us down the road of talking about zoning working with more of a master planning. Zoning's pretty critical, but being aware of current infrastructure. Those pieces will help. Further discussions we had around preserving industrial zoning, having room for that, and just doing a comprehensive master plan for the community instead of just spot zoning and those pieces, and having better relationships. I'm not sure if I missed anything. Anybody else want to pipe up? Yeah, we had a vocal table. ADU, accessory dwelling units, would be encouraged in specific zoning districts, talking more about design, building heights, standards, those pieces. Small lot, handwriting, small lot development standards can help with already small lot owners. Non-conforming is not bad, we heard that. But just again, design standards and discussions about that.
Reporting for Table 10. Our consensus was that yes, things are generally going in the right direction with the process. There were sort of mixed opinions about concern that it was a very urban vision for zoning and that may not be consistent with why some people moved to Missoula in terms of the density. Also, there was a general consensus that there needs to be tracking of the risk of losing entitlements to property that has current zoning, and if in the process of fixing the zoning there is downzoning that occurs, that has the potential to affect the value of property, and that needs to be tracked very carefully. As far as things that were missed, more emphasis on reducing transportation costs, and the second thing being looking at incentive-based inclusionary zoning or incentive-based affordable housing to look at how that might be incorporated into the zoning ordinance. Does that sum it up for our table? Yep.
I think at our table, we represented probably one of the characteristics of Missoula overall, and that is diversity. And although we agreed on a lot of things, we did not reach consensus on a lot of issues and items. So that's Missoula. We pretty much agreed that the concepts in here, generally overall, we've touched on everything. As far as specifically, I guess we won't know until we start addressing them specifically. So it's difficult to know in a nebulous general thing how to envision what's going on. But I'm going to give you the things that came out of our group. One, Missoula is way behind on street and road maintenance. This is not addressed. They should be a high priority. We need to take into consideration how to care for and maintain our current infrastructure so that we have streets and roads that people want to drive on or bike on or bring transportation, so they'll even want to come downtown. As far as top priorities for the update effort, open space and sustainability, which includes agriculture, clear, basic, predictable standards, affordable and diversified housing. We need to take into account the urban fringe. Not everybody wants to live downtown. As the core becomes denser, that we will still have folks who want their space, and it seems we're sometimes addressing growth by treating Missoula as if it were an island in itself. More land zoned exclusively for multifamily. Avoid regulatory review by citizens, volunteer boards, rather have review performed by professional planning staff. And like I said, it wasn't really a consensus, but that's our bag of ideas.
I'll go while you're waiting there. All right, so our table, table 9, we're in agreement that, yes, you're on the right track, and we came up with 4 items we thought were, I mean, they were all somewhat touched on, but we felt were somewhat missing. The speed of review and approval process, we thought should be something that gets strong consideration with all the various changes. Our second one was some specific reference to agriculture preservation. It was somewhat captured under the resource conservation issue, but that agriculture and agricultural uses itself, should be specifically referenced. Let's see, the issue of the transition when zoning changes take place, currently being able to show what was a conforming use back when it was done, and it seems like we're going to have a huge issue with that after we change everything. Determine, like, just somehow we want you to identify how we're going to deal with that. All the stuff that did conform and what doesn't now, or what does now and didn't then, and so on. And then not much is mentioned about the fringe area, and how that will become incorporated into the city, and how it will get zoned.
Okay, I'm doing table 4. We agreed that you're heading in the right direction. Things we thought that maybe you missed were the accessory dwelling units were not included. Clearly define how incentives would be provided. Let me see. For things you got wrong, we have you should preserve the best concepts of the cluster development and craft them in a better way. And then the weight put on neighborhood character. I'm not terribly sure how to say this one. I'll read the first one. We had the neighborhood character should not mean not in my backyard. Neighborhood characters need to be defined so that the elements you look at in the messed it up. So that the elements you look at describe the neighborhood, and it would be a tool that you would use for that.
Is that it? Do we do them all, Jeff? Okay. Well, on the positive side, I like the general yes theme. And in all honesty, I mean, that's really what we need to hear at this point. I mean, if the answer was no, we need to hear that too. And I understand completely the desire for additional detail. For those of you who haven't had a chance to look at the report, you'll find some additional detail, but still fairly high altitude theorizing about direction in the report. And no one here will be held accountable for their yes answer on the direction if what they see when we come forward with additional detail is off the reservation in terms of what we thought we were saying in the report. So this is not an instance where you speak now or forever hold your peace. As we move forward, we fully expect for some of these ideas that sounded good in theory to not look so good when we come forward with our initial draft of them. And in some cases, you'll send us back to the drawing board, and in some cases, you'll say, well, that was a harebrained idea to begin with. That's all fair. I want to make clear that this doesn't lock us into anything, but it gives us a general sense of the direction that we think we should be heading in. I heard several things as part of priorities and things that are missing that may be a bit beyond the scope of a zoning ordinance update. Maintenance of existing infrastructure is not something zoning and subdivision regulations are going to do a whole lot to address. that's not to dismiss it as an important issue, but I don't want to hold out unrealistic expectations. And that's just one thing I heard as part of the urban fringe issues, how to zone land as it's brought into the city, is not as directly affected by the text of the zoning ordinance as it will be policy decisions made at the council and planning board level in the future. The ordinance needs to have the right tools in place so that land can be zoned appropriately as it comes into the city. But I don't want to again hold out expectations that the zoning and subdivision effort is going to directly take on. There are parallel efforts. The urban I always mess that up. I lived in Central Texas in German, so I always think it's like as a German thing. But there are a lot of important policy efforts that are ongoing. And Mayor referred to them earlier. The workforce housing, affordable housing conversation that's begun. This urban fringe, urban policy, how to accommodate projected development. Historic preservation is sort of on a parallel track. So there are a number of policy initiatives that are tackling these issues head on. A couple of things that I heard that I do think are legitimate, and all of them are legitimate. I just don't hold out the prospect of zoning and subdivision update as solving all of them. Addressing the river, I think, was an excellent point. We talk about maybe clarifying some of the rules for riparian corridor protection, stream buffers and the like, just at least clarifying, if not maybe rethinking how we address that. But addressing the river per se as a development issue, I think is an important one. The green building theme is important. I think it receives a fair amount of attention in the report if you'll have an opportunity to relook at it. The tie to green building materials is tenuous, but zoning can do perhaps something to reward green building practices that have their origins more in the building code than the zoning code. So so that's kind of a mixed bag. The zoning transportation linkage thing, I may not have talked about it enough tonight, but I think the report really is strong in terms of that. I may not have used the right language. We'll go back and see if we can make that point a little bit stronger. Enforcement, excellent point. Not much talk in the ordinance about enforcement. There's only so much that the text of the ordinance can do when it comes to enforcement. Our job as your partners in this are to make sure that the ordinance provides a full range of tools that can be brought to bear ultimately when the ordinance is violated. But enforcement is really, boots on the ground, sort of tracking and monitoring violations and bringing them to successful resolution. Understand the importance of neighborhood planning. The maybe too urban vision is something not the first time I've heard it, and we'll take a look and see if the report can better express the intent, and our intent is that the ordinance needs to really have tools to address the entire continuum of place types in Missoula, ranging from semi-rural, suburban to truly urban conditions. I'm not by any means suggesting that a truly urban solution is appropriate in all areas of the city. Constantly monitoring the effect of new regulations or changes in approaches on housing types. Completely agree with those comments. The idea of the use of incentives is good as long as the outcome provides a true public benefit and was worth granting the incentive or bonus for. That accountability issue, I like the way that was characterized. That's couldn't agree more with that. Ag preservation, particularly the urban ag, the community gardens, the whole, that to me is a sustainability issue that zoning can do more to address. The preservation of agricultural generally that conversation needs to occur as part of the sort of urban fringe, suburbanization, that conversation. The ordinance can provide tools to implement that vision, but in and of itself, the creation of a new zoning ordinance isn't going to map out areas of the community where we're really serious about preserving agriculture. I just want to keep those expectations in check. So, not throwing out the best concept. Sometimes in talking about something, it is completely understandable that somebody hears me say, scrap it, throw it out, and they think that we wouldn't look at any of the positive characteristics that may be attached to one regulation or another. And I assure you, I will steal liberally from the best ideas that are in existing ordinance and others as we move forward. So let's talk a bit about where we go from here. I think our plan is to make some adjustments to the report to reflect some of your comments, to try and prepare at least a summary of individual comments that I hope you'll leave behind tonight so that we have a more accurate summary of the types of things we talked about. But, and then we'll prepare a revised version of this report, put it on the website, and it will serve as our sort of generalized blueprint and touchstone as we move forward in the drafting stage. We'll always refer back to it and say, well, are we doing the sorts of things that we talked about? But really, in earnest, within the next few weeks, we will begin to prepare the new regulations to get to that level of detail that so many of you are eager to get to. And our plan is to deliver the ordinance in small modules or chunks. Review it at staff level, at the advisory group, appropriate points, get it out on the web, let people know that things are available for review, and continue this conversation where we get input and we revise and refine the ideas. And that's really going to occur over most of the remainder of the year. We'll be coming forward with initial pieces of the ordinance within the next couple of months. Is our best estimate about that. And I urge you to continue to stay abreast of things by visiting the Zoning Missoula website, zoningmissoula.com. We endeavor at least to keep that as up to date as possible, to let people know the status of the project, when new things are available for review. Don't look for any new substantive material, as I say, for the next 2 or 3 months, because it's going to take us a while to prepare those initial drafts. But once we start getting that engine fired up, we'll begin to churn things out over the summer months, and we'll have opportunities to get together again. So stay tuned to the website. Call Laval over at OPG, email, get in contact with us in any way, things that you didn't think of tonight. I really appreciate everybody coming out, as always. And if we can answer any questions, we'd be happy to do so. So thanks a lot. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to thank all the members of the city council that are here.
Yeah.
It's a great thing to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I'm glad you said that, and we do have like 5 more minutes, so if anybody's got a question they want to ask in a large group setting, raise your hand. I see a question. I'm sorry?
Larger screens.
Yeah. That's not a question. Thanks again.